Gary, I'm very happy to have you again. We didn't talk for maybe a year and a half. Although recently we discussed standing buildings in the eastern Basel Desert of Jordan. And how was the COVID hiatus with you? You managed to dig in Jordan in 2021 and 2022.
Actually, we didn't dig in 21.
Okay.
We were going to, but again, it was a lockdown someplace. I think probably at the University of Chicago. But in 1922, yeah, then it was resumed. Although I didn't participate in the field work itself, I was doing lithics analysis back in Amman.
So can you summarize 2022 in brief lines? Although you didn't dig, but you were part of the project.
Yeah. Overall, the excavation continued very much in the way we had been doing it before, concentrating on the large structure called W80 and the smaller structure called W400, which was about 700 meters farther north from W80. W400, we reached the floor and did a subfloor probe, and it probably never held more than 3 or 4 people. Very small, 4 by 4, but there were a lot of interior walls that kind of subdivided the interior into sort of semicircular bays, and we're not sure why. But W400 was intriguing in the sense that it had something like 400 drills, if I recall, but only about 4 or 5 beads. So it looks like it was sort of a bead factory. The building was evidently connected to a animal enclosure. So it looks like maybe seasonally when there was pasturage for the sheep and goats, mom and dad would sit around drilling beads that they would probably or possibly trade with other people when they went back out into the desert. W80 was completely different. This was, in all the years we were excavating at W80, we were calling it a house.
Yeah.
It's about 6 to 7 meters in diameter on the interior and 8 to 9 meters from outside of the wall to outside of the wall. So it was very large in comparison to most of the buildings from this period of time, the late Neolithic, which was about 7,000 BC until about 5,000 BC. I haven't really talked this over with the other 2 co-directors, Alex Wass and York Rowan, but I'm considering that this is more of an industrial structure, which is also associated with ritual, perhaps even religious connotations. The interior of the building has got hearths here and there, and that wouldn't prevent anybody from using it as a dwelling. On the other hand, we've got tons of animal bone, and although a lot of the butchering probably took place out in a courtyard outside the structure itself, that must have been a fairly unpleasant place inside the structure with all of the decay of skins and flesh and whatever else is going on. One of the reasons I'm proposing this is, first of all, there doesn't appear to have been a roof. There's a central standing stone, which I think is partly associated with ritual, but it's only 1 meter high. And if that was a support for the ceiling or the roof, you'd be crawling around on the ground on your knees. Instead, I think there was a roof, but it was made of reeds, kind of in a dome-like structure. And the reason I'm considering this is because I reread a book that was published back in the 1930s, 1937, I think, called The Marsh Arabs, who lived in the marshes of southern Iraq. And they loved it. They lived in this dense marsh of reeds. And there are photographs on how they used the reeds. They literally built a cathedral, which was
out of reeds and out of bulrushes.
Yes. The structures show the construction going on in some of the buildings, and it's a man standing up on a bundle of reeds. He's climbed a bundle of reeds that have been tied together by a rope, and he's bending over another sort of thick diameter combination of reeds that are twisted together and tied. And that would have supported a tremendous amount of weight. So I think something like that, not to that degree, not that complex, could have been used to provide the shade, protection from the wind, and even by weaving bulrushes to provide a thatch, even if the site, and it probably was, even if the site was occupied in the wintertime, they could also provide protection from rain from time to time out there. So another element about the Marsh Arabs was that when they built dwellings, they didn't pay particular attention to style. They simply created long bundles of reeds that are tied together, and it sort of flopped over like a tent. And that would, I think, have served the people at W80. At Wadi Katafi, at the base of Mesa 7, it's the same age as W80. There is a building about the same size with the same interior pillar, standing stone. In the inside of that structure, again, we call it a house, there were so many hearths, so deep, and burned so hard that the basalt blocks had cracked. Now, I think that would be hard to sleep in under those conditions. Outside of that house, SS1, it was called. There, I just called it a house again. Outside of that structure,
yes,
there were 5 or 6 other heaps of fallen basalt structures. But they were very small, only 2 meters by 3 meters, not even 3 meters, maybe 1.5 meters by 2 meters. And that's enough for 1 to 2 people to sleep inside these low walls. Again, nothing to indicate a structure above it, but I suspect, again, they had simply built these sort of lean-tos for protection from the sun and from the weather. We didn't excavate those smaller structures, but looters had been tearing through them. And you could see low walls, only about 20 centimeters to 30 centimeters high, with no indication that it was anything higher than that at all. So it looks like we've got maybe families of 2 or 3, perhaps married couples, living around, again, some sort of an industrial complex. Here again, hundreds of bead drills and in this case, quite a few beads as well. So, yeah, I think most of these structures out there are not habitations, but workplaces
Like a small
associated with.
manufacturers, like a
Hmm?
small manufacturers,
Yeah, yeah. In
primitive
fact, I've
manufacturers and primitive prehistoric factories, so to
yeah,
say.
yeah, I think so. And it's not just production of beads. Um, there are also an awful lot of borers, so that they're probably working with wood, they're working with animal bone, and those kinds of materials might also find a market outside of the settlement itself. Um, so I think it requires a different approach, a different sort of ethnographic image of what that place was like. It's not like a camp at, I don't know, it's not like a Bedouin camp.
Yeah,
Instead, it's not focused on sheep and goats. It's focused on some other kind of production, I think.
of course, that production was probably related to goat herding and sheep herding in that area.
Well, I think certainly out in Katafi and in Wasad, another major industry was simply gazelle hunting
Yes.
using kites. And I'd like to bring something up. We've now had reports from our faunal analysts that sheep and goats constituted around 25% of all of the animal bones. Gazelle represented 50%. And that makes it seem like gazelle were twice as important to these people. And I have to dispute that. When you kill a gazelle, it gives you something once. But if you've got sheep and goats out there, the female sheep are providing milk every day. Well, I mean, not all year long, but they're for long periods of time. They're providing milk that can be converted, well, either drunk fresh or converted into a variety of different butters and yogurts. And especially with, what is the dry yogurt called in Arabic? I forgot.
No, you're probably talking about
Jamid.
Jamid. Yeah,
Yeah.
well-known Jamid.
Yeah, and that can be stored for long periods of time.
Absolutely.
So I think we have to back off and say that these are not just hunter herders. These are hunters and herders, equally contributing to the diet and economic sort of marketing.
I mean, we're talking about sedentary population of Wisat Pools and Safafi region. I mean, we have.
It is a possibility that, you know, when we think of the desert today, we see that the Bedouin with their sheep and goats, at least 50 years ago and more, were moving constantly from place to place to place, and not so much because. Well, let me start that over again. They were moving seasonally, and in fact, they may have been moving every couple of months.
They do.
Yeah, because of vegetation drying up, but especially because of water. Now, over the last month or 6 weeks, I've been looking at the situation about water. There's a site in the Jordan Valley, exactly where the Wadi Yarmouk enters the Jordan Valley, called Shahar HaGolan. And it's late Neolithic, dates from 6,500 to perhaps 5,500. So it's the same age as Wasad and Katafi. And the excavators found a well, a circular shaft that had gone 3.3 meters below the surface and hit the water table. The shaft, this is an amazing
Mhm.
discovery. And in fact, the discovery was made about 20 years ago now. Yeah, roughly. And it's the photographs, the drawings are just very impressive. So could these people living at Katafi and Wasad also have been harvesting water in the same manner? The concept was available and certainly was not a secret. And the technology was obviously available because it's simply digging down and building a tube using basalt stones. Now that sounds far-fetched, and I agree. It does require an awful lot of faith here to believe it. But when we first went to Wasad back in 2009, we did a survey, and on the eastern edge of the basalt at Wasad Pools, right on the edge of a very large was a fairly substantial well, and it had basalt boulders, sort of looked like a daisy flower. The interior was probably 7 or 8 meters in diameter, and it was completely filled up. There's nothing to indicate anything about its age, but it was probably not older, not younger than, the Umayyad period or even later, maybe the 15th century or so. But the important thing about that well is that there was a water table that could be reached. And there's that ka at Wasad. There's also a smaller ka near Wasad that's closer to the settlement itself. At we're talking about here, Katafi. What about Katafi? Yeah, at Katafi, back in 2016, I think it was, a geoarchaeologist was working with us, and he was taking samples, core samples, and they're using these little tools to dig down as deep as they could. And when he reached 2.5 meters below the surface, he was no longer digging, dry silt, sandy silt. He was coming up with material that had the consistency of bread dough. It was not terribly liquid, but if he had managed to go even deeper, he may have hit a water table out there now, a water table that was probably much lower than it was 5,000 years ago. So I think we can't ignore the possibility that these people were able to stay out there all year long. Now, this brings up seasonality. Obviously, gazelle hunting was very important to these people. But if you're using these mass slaughter techniques based on the construction of these kites, these traps, you need a labor crew for the construction. Carrying basalt blocks or basalt boulders that weigh 30, 40, 50 kilograms each.
Kilograms, yeah.
It's not something you want to spend an awful lot of time at unless there's a good reward. Professor Kempe here in Technical University, Darmstadt, did some surveys out there, and he's come up with some calculations that said that a medium-sized kite, and these are actually relatively small, could be constructed by a labor force of 10 people in, I think he said 53 to 63 days. So that's kind of a winter time. Yeah. And in fact, looking at the behavior of gazelle, during the winter, they're dispersed. They aren't herds anymore. They're just kind of meandering individuals. So that's the best time to do the construction, in the winter. What's another reason for the best time? You've been out there in the summertime? It is hellish hot,
Of course.
and yeah, so it's best to
The
do all
temperature is
of
50 degrees Celsius in the summertime. So I don't think
Yeah.
that it's recommendable to get involved with heavy duty work
Yeah,
in the scorching
absolutely.
sun.
Well, at the same time, another aspect of the gazelle behavior is that beginning in the spring,
Mhm,
when the rutting season, when reproduction begins to send these hormones through
mhm.
male and female gazelle at the same time, all of those individuals or those very small groups start sort of collapsing into large herds, 200 gazelle or more. Not always that large, but and this provides a new tactic that hunters can use. Before kites were used, if you were hunting gazelle, you had to stalk them individually,
Yeah,
and your chances were not always, very
very
high
high
that
to
you would
catch
come
them, of
back.
course.
Yeah, but now with those gazelle, with those kites,
With the time, with the sorry, with traps.
pardon me.
I said with kites as a trap.
Yeah, with kites.
Yeah.
But by using dogs, you could have a hunting crew go out, sick the dogs on the gazelle herd, and
Hmm.
they're very skittish, very anxious ridden, and they panic and they run up to the guiding walls of the kite, and they might panic and run for kilometers until they reach the trap. And once they're in the trap,
Yeah.
then your chances are 100%
That you
of
of
getting a
course,
kill.
of course.
I'd like to bring up an example of the quality of that kind of tactic. While Abu Aziza and Remy Kassar had been working down near the Saudi border in southern Jordan, there's no basalt down there. So everything that they're building is made of limestone. But even so, they have kites, quite a few kites down there. And while Remy excavated a campsite very close to one of the kites, and they found a pit
Hmm.
in the camp itself that was, I don't know, a meter deep, something like that, maybe even more. And inside that pit were the bones of a minimum of 148 gazelle. Oh, it must
Yeah,
have really been stinking,
of course,
after all that butchering.
of
And
course.
so now I've done some calculations, and if you look at the average gazelle, average adult gazelle,
Yeah,
and multiply the weight that average gazelle provides in terms of meat, those 148 gazelle would have provided a ton of meat, a
yeah. That
1,000 kilograms.
yeah,
Now, if you've got a hunting team of 4 or 5 people, how are you going to get that back to your families?
true.
One thing, of course, you can reduce the weight by drying the meat and even salting it as well. So that'll take maybe half of the weight away, the water that
Hmm.
dries out. But now also look at the other part of the gazelle, and that's the skin. It's been suggested that the skins were used for trading with the agricultural communities in the West, around Ain Ghazal or Zarqa,
Yeah,
whatever. Well, those skins are going to bring it right up again. The weight that you have to carry is going to move it from a half a ton of meat up to another 250 kilograms of skin. So we're still talking about monumental efforts here to take advantage of something you've just done. And how that happens, I don't know. Maybe they have a runner who goes off to the nearest main settlement, and an army of, brothers, wives, uncles, whatever,
Of course.
come out and carry 20
Yeah.
kilograms each back. That's a possibility.
They
But I
need
think this is
they need the whole tribe to take such amount of meat.
sure.
Four
Yeah,
people
absolutely.
cannot carry 1 ton of anything.
No, no. So I think, yeah, I mean, certainly it was a very exciting time in terms of eating until you explode almost.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, these people had a fairly comfortable situation out there. First of all, there was more water, there was more pasturage. Oh, and then coming back to this possibility of sedentary
Yeah.
stays out there. If it were the case that children and women stayed in the camp rather than going out and hunting, some of the women may have gone out hunting too. They could stay in camp, manage the sheep and goats on pasture that was much greater than what we see today. So there's a picture of something that is certainly different than what the desert provides to the imagination now.
How many desert kites we have in Jordan? Jordan is one of the countries with lots of desert kites. Another one is Armenia, and also we have desert kites in Hijaz in Saudi Arabia.
Oh yeah, David Kennedy has done an awful lot of Google Earth and helicopter photography, and he has counted a minimum of 1,400 kites, some of which have guiding walls that are 10 kilometers long. That's a lot of labor. But within the border of Jordan, it's 1,400.
Yeah.
And then add more more hundreds anyway,
of course,
from northern Saudi Arabia and Syria. At Wasad Pools, there are 20 within a 10-kilometer radius, I think, or a 15-kilometer radius. At the closest one to Wasad Pools itself is 3.5 kilometers outside the settlement. In Katafi, there are a minimum of 4 kites in the site, which is kind of curious. Again, you just kind of, there you could just keep the gazelle in the kite and walk off and shoot a gazelle and take it home. We don't know if that's what happened, but there are a lot of kites and a lot of availability of opportunities for the people out there.
Did they use desert kites recently, 100 years ago or 200 years ago, or they stopped that practice?
I think they probably stopped the practice, and the reason I say so is because from the European travelers who were moving around out there doing mostly just traveling, sightseeing in a sense, they don't mention anything about the hunting that would have been probably pretty impressive. And other visitors were saying those are not hunting traps, those are places where people keep their sheep and goats. And that suggests that abandoned kites may have been, in fact, used seasonally to keep the sheep and goats inside those kites, rather than using them as a hunting technique. But I think the purpose is not to create an animal enclosure. It's look at this, we have an animal enclosure that nobody wants anymore. So I think that's mostly the situation. The most recent indicator for the use of these as hunting elements, I think comes from the early Bronze Age, certainly, perhaps all the way up into the Middle Bronze Age, but I don't know for certain how that's determined. You're rarely going to find anything to date except the flints, and I don't know if you can say Middle Bronze on the basis of the flints.
Regarding sedentary population, what kind of diet they had? Did they grow some crops, and what kind of crops they produced in Eastern Desert? Because people perceive Eastern Desert as a desolate place with no water, but during Neolithic time and early Bronze Age, vegetation was different, and there were more water in that area.
One of the important elements here is, first of all, there was higher rainfall.
Yes.
Maybe 50% more than they get today. And in some parts of that Eastern Desert, that might have been 250 millimeters per year. And when you talk to a farmer today, that's not enough. That your crops are going to die. Well, depending on what kind of soil you have, that might be true. But on the other hand, under W66 and under W80, we found that reddish, gritty soil, not the silt that's up there today that acts to let water run off. That gritty soil would have become sort of like a bathtub.
Yeah.
It would have absorbed the water. It would have kept the water in there. And you could probably, at least from time to time, let's say maybe for 3 or 4 years straight, the rainfall accumulating in that soil may have been enough to raise wheat and barley, although nothing like that has been found, as far as I know, in terms of the phytogeography. On the other hand, another part of the diet is the presence of oak trees. We've got oak charcoal out there. We've got oak pollen of what's called Tabor oak, which is the biggest producer of acorns of the entire oak family. And you can't eat acorns without getting rid of what's called the tannic acid. It's what makes it taste very bitter, but you just can't eat it. But again, if they've got well capacities, if they can somehow accumulate water into pits, or you crush the acorns in grinding stones, and I think we may have mentioned this before, there are grinding stones during this time that have a semicircular depression in the center of it, which is identical to acorn processing grinding stones during the Natufian period, and certainly it was still being practiced in the 1870s to the early 1900s in California, in the oak forests there by the local populations. So you can make acorn bread. Once you get rid of that bitter material, you can make acorn bread. Other things you could eat, there are roots of reeds. Reeds and bulrushes have these long roots, very starchy, kind of like, starchy like potatoes are starchy. They don't necessarily taste like that. And then there were some fruits available. At Katafi, we found a dried fig that had, it dried out immediately, so it didn't decay. And figs certainly require a fairly high amount of water. So there may have been other kinds of fruits as well. We don't know.
We can talk about standing structures in the second session. I'm going to send you the link in a few seconds, because here we're running out of time. We have only 3.5 minutes, so
Okay.
I'll better start the new session, and I'll send you the link.
Okay, good.
This time we're going to continue our conversation talking about megaliths and standing structures, which might be chalcolithic structures. They may represent some form of a primitive religion or primitive paganism back then. What do you think about standing structures and megaliths in the Black Desert?
Well, interestingly, in my mind, we don't see anything suggesting some sort of major concern about ritual and perhaps religious sort of focus on anything earlier than the 7th millennium. There were always hunters out there in the Natufian. There were hunters out there in the PPNA, the PPNB, but it's not until we get into the PPNC and even later in the late Neolithic, possibly not even in the PPNC. I don't know. We don't have that well dated yet out there, but it's beginning at around 6600 BC, where we begin to see standing stones popping up as part of the architecture, and sometimes just standing stones all by themselves in the middle of nowhere. I think I mentioned before, you can consider these standing stones to be of two different types. The isolates, which have no evident connection with structures, although it's often the case that isolated standing stones might be associated with a small pavement. And what the pavement was used for, we don't know. And the second type is one that's incorporated into structures. Now, at Wasad Pools, we've excavated 3 structures completely and another structure only temporarily, only partially, mainly because the looting had made it very dangerous to dig any deeper than we had gone. And of those 4 structures, all of them dating to middle of the 7th millennium until 5500 or so BC, was a standing stone in the center of the structure. The standing stones didn't bear any kind of engraving or etching or painting or anything we could see that made the stone itself special beyond simply kind of a surprising element that didn't have anything to do with keeping the building standing. In those same structures, we also had, in addition to a standing stone and not far from the standing stone, was a semicircular alcove about 1 meter wide and 1 meter, not quite 1 meter deep, that is into the wall, that was plastered a number of times. The different plasterings at W80, for example, and the plastering in W66, which is only about 50 meters or less from W80. The different plastering episodes were separated by 4 to 5 centimeters of dirt, suggesting that this was a renewal, suggesting that the buildings may have been abandoned for a amount of time, and wind and silt had been deposited by wind. And when the house, when the structure was reoccupied, they re-plastered everything as sort of renewal of the building and what functions the building provided. The standing stones don't seem to line up with anything. I mean, they're in the center, so they line up with everything.
Yeah.
But we don't see any special axes associated. The standing stones are not circular; they're rectilinear solids, a kind of rectangular solid. So it's got long edges and it's got short edges, but they don't seem to be oriented in any specific sort of angle to anything else in the buildings. So again, maybe this is some sort of spiritual representation of the family heritage, family spirits. It's hard to say. The standing stones probably form one part of a cultic aspect to these structures. The alcoves themselves being plastered is a second part. The third part is a plastering of the entire floor. Now, the plaster out there is gypsum plaster. It is not very strong. It powders very quickly. So suddenly you've got a plaster floor becoming a floor of white dust. And again, this may be replastered after an abandonment, although we don't have good evidence for that, the entire floor. We've got 2 floors at W80, but both of them are so, 2 superimposed floors. But the only evidence of the plaster, in addition to the powder, is some intact plaster still along the walls. At W66, the plaster floor was broken up, although there were large sections that were still in good shape. There was a sort of a basin shape, about 40 centimeters in diameter, only about 5 to 7 centimeters deep. That had been placed in front of the alcove, between the standing stone and the alcove. So here again, we might have some sort of element associated with liquids in some kind of ritual ceremony, although we don't have a basin in W80. In Katafi, Mesa 7, structure SS1, we had 2 plaster basins, smaller and not built into the floor. They were simply plaster basins like, a salad bowl or something, whatever. Maybe 3 centimeters thick, 4 centimeters thick, and curving at the edges, like a bowl. One had been placed on top of the floor, which was not plastered. The floor was not plastered. And then SS1 appears to have been abandoned for a while. And then a second one was placed on top of the original. And again, with an accumulation of windblown silt, about 3 centimeters thick or so. So there's no indication how those basins were used. They were made of lime plaster, not of gypsum plaster.
Yeah.
And lime plaster is a lot stronger. In fact, in the later of the two basins, one could still see the finger marks as they were shaping it. It's kind of creepy in a way.
Yeah.
Also in the same building and right next to the standing stone, there was a pit about 30 centimeters deep and 40 centimeters in diameter, or is it the other way around? I can't remember right now, but it was a substantial pit that was entirely coated with lime plaster. Lime plaster will not absorb the liquid.
Yeah.
And this looks like it was some kind of, oh, I don't know what you might call it, a place to store water, perhaps, again, in association with some sort of ritual practice.
Like a container.
Yeah, it's a container.
Like a container for water.
Yeah, they would have had to bring water in and bag in skins or something to fill it up. And it might be that that water container was not ritual at all. It may be that some other kind of industrial practice that they were involved in needed water. And so you could just scoop water out whenever you needed it. You know, the intent of that pit, of that cylindrical pit, you know, you can kind of make up any story you want. Yeah.
What do you think of,
in
what do you
those
think? Yeah, please. I
small
interrupted you.
structures around SS1,
You wanted to say something. I
I didn't
interrupted you.
understand you.
I interrupted you. Just keep
Oh, I see.
talking. Yeah.
Yeah, in again SS1 that had that cylindrical pit, maybe for holding water. It's surrounded by those smaller structures that had collapsed, and I said may have only been sleeping chambers, perhaps, for one or two people each. There was never anything like a small standing stone at one end. Again, you know, some sort of ritual thing. That it looks completely practical. That instead of sleeping in the same place where you've been butchering animals, you go off into this maybe roofed, this small sleeping chamber roofed with reeds again, to keep you cool or dry or whatever. So,
Can you say a few words? Yes.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Can you say a few words about towering tombs? Because you also discovered towering tombs in the same area. This is also interesting.
The Neolithic, the late Neolithic ends at around 5000 BC. And nominally, it's replaced by the Chalcolithic, although we don't have any definite proof of Chalcolithic out in Wisad or at Katafi. But certainly we do have Bronze Age structures out there, or at least we think they're Bronze Age. But we also have Iron Age and maybe some Safaitic structures. Now, we have no tombs from the Neolithic. We have what we think are cemeteries at Wasad, small clusters of maybe stone piles, a couple of meters in diameter, not very high. And at Wasad, it also looks like we may have had cemeteries associated with a particular cluster of buildings. We think, or I think, again, I don't want to put words in Alex's or York's mouths. I think there were neighborhoods at Wasad Pools and probably at Catafi as well, of related families. And they may also represent families at completely different times, maybe 100 years between each neighborhood, or even more. But even so, we don't have any burials, and that's a problem. I'm really sad about it. We don't get burials until the Iron Age. We started out at Wasad, at W80, by excavating what we thought was a tower tomb. Tower tombs are standing structures that are impressive in the sense that they're 2 to 3 meters high and about 3 to 5 meters in diameter. You can't miss them unless you're blind, like I was. Like Alex and I were the first time we visited Wasad in 2002. We just saw a whole bunch of basalt, and that's all we saw. It wasn't until we came back 9 years later that we understood that there was something special. The tower tombs are apparently Iron Age, based on what Ackermans has found during his work out there. Although what part of the Iron Age, we don't know. Some of those tower tombs have memorials, or, well, I can't remember the name, the word I want to use.
Inscriptions.
No, there's no inscriptions.
No inscriptions on towers.
No, they're structures. They're small
Okay.
structures, 1 meter by 1.5 meters. And they're built in well, they start out not as structures, but actually just piles of stone, separated by about 1 meter, and then another pile of stone, 1 meter pile of stone, and then suddenly they become constructed chambers. And these appear to be sort of memorials to the person or the tribe of the person who was buried in that tower tomb. We have one tower tomb at Wasad that has 44 of these structures coming off, kind of like a tail or a chain of memorials. At Wasad Pools, at Catafi, on top of Mesa number 4, there's one with 54 of these memorials. They're empty, nothing in the structures. We've looked through several of them, and there's nothing to indicate there was ever anything placed in there, unless it was organic and it disappeared. Yeah. But there are no artifacts inside them. So those are Iron Age. We also have some megalithic structures that are not, as far as we can tell, that are not tower tombs. We have a tower at Wasad Pools that is unlike any of the other towers at Wasad Pools or in Catafi. It's much larger. It's 8 meters in diameter, not 3 to 5. The interior is 6 meters in diameter, not 5, or not 4. It is attached to the eastern side towards the rising sun is a circular courtyard, but it's not an animal enclosure. It was paved with basalt blocks, and it had 2 U-shaped structures built into the ground. The walls were about 3 meters by 3 meters. So that you had 2 of these U-shaped structures with the openings facing towards the tower. The tower there have been attempts to loot it. We didn't have enough time to excavate it. But the silt is almost like cement now. It's very difficult to dig that. But the purpose of that, we don't know. That courtyard, again, it looks like it was a paved audience area. Again, if the tower represents a human that was buried there, we don't know, but it could be, again, that it's simply a tower representing a tribe, perhaps. We have other monumental structures as well, and the dates we don't know. And again, they're not, they contained bodies. We found fragments of bone that looters have sort of tossed out. But again, nothing datable in terms of the interior. One of the structures is about 3 meters or 4 meters long. It's rectangular, evidently, and about 2.5 meters wide. And at the looters completely destroyed it. But one of the stones is 2.5 meters long. And it looks like it may have stood upright at one time. Now it's lying on one edge. Perhaps the looters tipped it over, we don't know. That stone is also coated with lime plaster on one surface. There's another tomb not far from that one that is built of standing stones next to each other. And it looks like there are 2 chambers. Again, about maybe 6 or 7 meters in an east-west direction and 3 meters, 3.5 meters in a north-south direction. And the standing stones that form the walls looks just like Kurban Beni Mura down in eastern Jaffa, where Hans-Georg Gabel excavated. And that looks like it was Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age. Just chain of those tombs goes on forever. We found in that looted tomb pottery, painted pottery, which was just red paint that was dripping down from the rim. But I haven't been able to find any sort of comparable decorated pottery. The shape, the pottery was well made, well fired. Unfortunately, it was broken, and we don't have all the pieces that go together. But its shape certainly would fit in very nicely with Chalcolithic. We also have other sort of mausoleums. There's one that again looks like it was used twice. It's more or less dome shaped, I think. We don't have the dome part anymore. But it's got an eastern wall that's perfectly vertical. And east of that eastern wall is another rectangular structure that has 2 terraces with a difference in elevation of only 20 centimeters, paved on both terraces. And that eastern wall has an obvious hole where part of the wall was dismantled and probably another burial inside the tomb, and then the wall was reconstructed. We have another one very similar to that. Again, it looks like it may have been sort of round and domed. Again, we don't have the dome. It also has an eastward, well, it's not paved. Well, it is paved, but it's not flat paving. But a collection of basalt pebbles.
Of course.
And in,
No, nothing. Just keep.
Oh, and scattered all over that that platform, under that, yeah, call it a platform, are these tiny little 1 by 2 centimeter transparent, translucent, colored flint. Brown, gray, red, orange, yellow, no green yet that we found. But this looks like it was a very special platform. That's about the only place we find that translucent paint. And also at the eastern edge, yeah, this platform was not rectangular. It was apsidal. Instead of a 90-degree turn on the corners, there was a curved, bowed element. So that, yeah. Here again, we don't have, there's nothing there in terms of pottery. There's nothing, there's no flint associated with these things. So we're kind of left high and dry. Coming back to other standing stones.
Yeah.
We have
Yes.
another complex at Wasad Pools, which is very large. It's got a circular arrangement of basalt stones. It's not really a wall, but it has a standing stone against the western part of that circle. The circle is about 1.5 meters, maybe 2 meters in diameter. The standing stone, yeah, it's less than 1 meter high, but even so, it's prominent. You can see it. Now that stands outside of another rectilinear compound of, I guess, about 10 meters by 15 meters in size. There is a tomb at the back. Again, perhaps 2 more burials there. There are 2 large rooms, 3 meters by 3 meters roughly. And the construction technique in those rooms is all large basalt slabs, maybe 15 centimeters thick and 75 centimeters high and maybe 1 meter long, set on edge like building, like Legos. Although not a single artifact inside that room. There's a courtyard running west to east. It has an entrance to that thing. And inside, in that open area,
Yeah.
are 2 U-shaped structures again, but built of single stones. So this is one slab, this is another slab, and another slab like this. It has 2 of them, one east of the other. And in the center of that U is another standing stone. It's small. The slabs are not more than 25 centimeters in height, maybe 40 centimeters in length. And that standing stone in both of them is only about 15 to 20 centimeters high. So, and then in the rest of the complex, on the western side of the tomb area are 2 large, one very large rectangular structure, 3 meters by 3 meters, with an opening facing towards the west. And those, we have a couple more of those at Wasad Pools too. But again, not a single artifact give us a clue of how old they are or what their purpose was. So,
For the end, I'm going to ask you what you're planning to do in 2023. Are you coming back to Jordan to dig, or?
No, I'm hoping to get some funding to go back. The 2019 and 2022 flints that we excavated from Wasad have not been analyzed yet. So I'm hoping to get funding, spend about 4 months in Amman doing that. And even if the funding doesn't come through, I've already been asked by a French team, British team, to analyze flints from a 2-year survey they made out by Umasacum, just north of Ozark. So
Nice.
I'll be there for at least 1 month.
So we're going to see you in Jordan this year.
Pardon me?
We're going to see you in Jordan this year.
Inshallah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I miss it.
Well, we're missing you, and you're always more than welcome here.
Well, thank you. I'll probably be back even if I didn't have flints to analyze, just to see old friends.
Thank you so much for your time, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in Amman in a couple of weeks, couple of months. I wish you all the best, and we'll keep in touch.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks a lot, Saad.
Thank you so much. All the best.
Bye-bye.